Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, March 4th, 2025. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also president of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He has led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts, as well as peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for all you do for the Washington Brief. Welcome to our audience. We're so happy to be back. Our topic today is China walks a tightrope. Admiral Sam Paparo, head of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, said China's aggressive maneuvers around Taiwan aren't exercises. They are rehearsals for the forced unification of Taiwan to the mainland. Is this likely? What will prevent China from using force? Our expert panel today will be addressing these questions and more. And I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Alexandre Mansourov, who is our panelist. Dr. Mansorov's adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's also an adjunct professor of Korean Studies in the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Our moderator today has so much experience in the Northeast Asia and around the world. Ambassador Joseph DeTrani is a commentator on security issues for many news media organizations and television. Formerly, he was a special envoy to the six-party talks with North Korea and the director of the National Counter-Proliferation Center and associate director of national intelligence. Ambassador DeTrani is the author of The North Korean Threat, Intelligence and Diplomacy, published by the National Institute for Public Policy. Our special guest panelist today is Mr. David Sauer. David is a retired CIA officer who served as chief of station on duty, deputy chief of station in multiple overseas command positions in East Asia and South Asia, including Taiwan and Japan. He was also stationed in Beijing. He worked with Ambassador DeTrani at a time when the ambassador was doing the work as ambassador to the six-party talks with North Korea. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador Joseph DeTrani. We're so happy to be back.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the lovely introduction. We're very fortunate to have David with us today. I can't think of anyone who knows the issues related to Taiwan better than David Sauer. So let's just dive into that. Well, let me just say, we are seeing progress in Gaza with the ceasefire. We're talking about the potential for peace between the Russian Federation and Ukraine for that war that's going into its fourth year. So we're seeing some progress along the lines that Michael indicated. But on the whole issue of Taiwan, and today it's a deep dive on Taiwan, we're seeing some indications from the People's Republic of China. And Michael Jenkins just mentioned very astutely that our commander in the Indo-Pacific Command said that the recent live fire drills from the PRC, People's Republic of China, around Taiwan were rehearsals. Mind you, rehearsals for the unification, not the peaceful unification, obviously the forceful unification. So let's do a deep dive into Taiwan today, and we'll move into other areas, but I would love to focus on Taiwan. And David, I can't think of anyone who's better than you on the issue of Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. David, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador DeTrani, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your program today. And Alexander, it's always a pleasure to speak with you as well. And I think that when we consider what's happening in the Taiwan Strait, when I appeared on your show back in August 2023, I really talked about what I thought was China's strategy, and that really is a coercive strategy right up to the point of kinetic options in that they're trying to force Taiwan society, and the Taiwan government to essentially capitulate and accept reunification with China. So I really, if you're talking about in terms of the probability of a full-scale invasion being implemented by China this year, I actually think it's quite low, absent, some type of thing where like Taiwan declares formal independence, or U.S. stations or Japan stations large-scale troops on Taiwan. Otherwise, I just don't see it. I think the Chinese really want to prosecute this coercive strategy. They don't want a military conflict. That's really their last resort. They want to win without fighting. They don't want to pay for it. I mean, you're talking about Gaza. You've talked about, before we started taping here, we're talking about Ukraine. They don't want to repair that kind of wide-scale destruction in Taiwan. Instead, they just want to keep the pressure on Taiwan using their multifaceted strategy, which is military intimidation, economic reward and punishment for different areas inside Taiwan. It's cyber, it's misinformation campaigns, it's diplomatic isolation, all in an effort to shape the Taiwan population and make them think, well, our best option really is to reunify with the mainland. But I think when we think about Taiwan, I think for your viewers, there's like 5 points I really want to make about the situation. And that to me helps frame when I think about the cross-strait issue. And number one, there can be no strategic surprise for the United States about what's happening in cross-straits. Xi Jinping has been crystal clear about his strategic intent. He wants to reunify with Taiwan, and he's made that very clear to everyone, any foreigner, senior leader that he meets. He's told, reportedly told President Biden at the time that, peace is fine, but at some point we got to resolve this issue. He gets quite animated about it as well. According to, after he met with Macron and about the president of France in about early summer 2023, I mean, he was quite animated about how Taiwan is part of China. So he's very convinced of it. He's a tough, as President Trump calls him, fierce, and he's not going to be easily dissuaded from his goal of taking Taiwan back. And what's in it for him? Well, if he's successful, and he's successful in doing this without resorting to kinetic, he'll go down in Chinese history as one of the greatest leaders of all time. But the fact is that he needs that kinetic option, and he has told his commanders, according to multiple press reports, to be ready by 2027 to give him the full range of options in order to try to take Taiwan, and that includes the full-scale invasion. And so the other thing I'd really like to leave your viewers is we can't think of the Chinese military, the PLA, as a near-peer competitor. They are a peer competitor. They are Blue Water Navy. Their Navy is larger than ours in numbers. Their Air Force is either as large or is going to be larger quite soon. They've made massive increases in their capabilities, their nuclear weapons capabilities, their space capabilities. And if you listen to either retired senior military officers or senior military officers, U.S. military officers, given speeches, when they talk about China, they talk about the adjective they often use is breathtaking, at how rapidly China is increasing their capabilities. And, they've hardened very hard to degrade their Air Force if there is a conflict that develops. In Western Beijing, they're developing a new command center that is 5 times the size of the Pentagon, which is hard to believe given the giant size of our Pentagon. They've tripled the number since the early 2020s, of the number of their sophisticated munitions and missile systems. They have 1,500 mobile missile launcher systems. So they have incredible capability, or gaining incredible capability, which is only going to grow through 2027. So recently, in the last couple of months, what has happened is some open source imagery has detected that they're building at least 5. It's hard to describe what they are. They're like in World War II, we used mulberry harbors, like mobile harbors that were able to put off the beaches and land heavy equipment. Well, our open source imagery has detected at least 5 of these vessels being built in Guangzhou, that they have like a 120-meter bridge that can be deployed and land over a big bridge and land onto a road, and then a surface vessel would marry with it, offload the heavy equipment, and they would go over the beach onto different areas within wherever they're landing. Now, so I think that's going to be critical for them to build those, exercise with those, and that's something that needs to be accomplished. Now, there's been a lot of news reports about the state of China's economy. And China's economy has been doing terribly ever since they opened up from COVID. And the real estate sector has deflated. And so that has a massive negative wealth effect on Chinese consumers who invested in real estate in order to become more wealthy as the real estate sector went up. So they haven't been able to get their consumer economy on track. And in fact, this week they're having their National People's Congress, and they're going to announce some stimulus measures. But even with those extreme economic difficulties, have they reduced their military upgrades, military modernization? No, they haven't. So I think that's a real indicator of their strategic intent. There have also been like corruption and essentially purges within the senior military officer rank. They have had in their strategic rocket forces and in their general equipment department areas in which large-scale contracts are purchased and made. They've fired some senior members of that, 2 former defense ministers, some members of the strategic rocket forces, and several members of their military industrial complex. And, you know, that appears to be simple graft. Now, is that going to really hold them back? Well, again, they're keeping to modernize, they're keeping to exercises. So it looks like they're still full steam ahead. In the short term, that might have some impact, that they got to investigate all those different officers for corruption and their associates to find those and see if that impacted the military equipment that was procured. But in the long term, in the next couple of years, they're going to solve that and become more professional. Also very concerning for them was the dismissal of Admiral Miao Hua, who was the director of the Central Military Commission's Political Warfare Department. Now, he was handpicked by Xi Jinping for that role. And the Political Warfare Department, you know, based in a very basic sense, is like the HR for the PLA, the Human Resources. And he had a lot of power to promote, Miao Hua did, to promote people. And traditionally within the Chinese military, that promotion system is really a source of graft. But I think more importantly, Miao Hua maybe was promoting people that were loyal to him, vice loyal to the party. And the PLA and the party have instituted kind of a re-education campaign for the military, and that might have some impact on readiness. But at the end of the day, we have to consider them to be a peer military competitor to the United States. The third thing is, you know, Taiwan can't really survive without US support. And if a military conflict should develop, even a blockade, they're going to need pretty massive US military assistance to survive. And so starting at least in 2017, the US government has highly encouraged the Taiwan government to kind of change their approach on defense, to try to make it more resilient, to try to develop a more, what a lot of people will say is this porcupine strategy, where you have them acquire, you know, smaller, lethal and mobile systems that would survive in a high intensity war. And, Taiwan has taken that on board, but it's moving slowly, as things do in a democracy. They've almost doubled their defense budget over the last 8 years. They have reenacted conscription. So I think this is the second year where people will have to go in and do their military service. They're trying to develop their reserves system as well to make it a real functioning military, to develop a real functioning military capability. But these things take time. And right now their military, their only total is about 150,000 active duty service members. That's tiny. And, they need more military resources. They can't defeat a full-scale war with China. What the best they can hope for is to hold out as long as they can until the U.S. cavalry, and hopefully along with Japan and Australia, and maybe with the Philippines as well, helping us with bases and infrastructure, can meaningfully intervene and try to prevent and stop the Chinese military from being successful. Now, in January of 2024, the Democratic Progressive Party's candidate for the presidency, William Lai Ching-te, won the election. He was inaugurated in May 2025. And unfortunately for him, and probably for Taiwan, his Democratic Progressive Party did not win a majority in the legislature. And so they are faced with a prospect of their legislative agenda being blocked by the Nationalist Party, the KMT, and the Taiwan People's Party. And that's had a real restraining factor on Taiwan's military. They've put a freeze on Taiwan's indigenous submarine program. They're trying to develop their own drone industry, a 50% freeze on that, spending on that activity. And they've also freezed some operational funds. So Taiwan has had to, William Lai, in order to get his defense spending up, has had to use what they call as a special budget. It's kind of an off-the-books fund for the president to use to meet national requirements. And he's doing that to push their defense spending above 3% for the year. Now, the other thing I think is really important, so, Xi Jinping's strategic intent is clear. He's getting more and more military capability to implement the forced reunification, although that's not his first choice. The third thing is Taiwan really can't stand unless we massively assist them in case of a war. But the fourth thing is for people to really keep in mind as well is Taiwan is central to the electronic component sector in the global economy. And you've all heard, all your listeners, I'm sure, have heard about how important Taiwan semiconductor is to the global economy. And it's true. They make probably 90% of the very high-end semiconductors that are used in artificial intelligence applications, cell phones, military systems. That's all made in Taiwan. So probably every one of your listeners somehow has got exposure to NVIDIA stock. NVIDIA makes all the high-end artificial intelligence chips. They design them. Well, they're all made in Taiwan. Now, with bipartisan support, the US Congress passed and was signed into law the CHIPS Act a couple of years ago, which gave subsidies to foreign firms to invest in the United States. And that's had some positive effect. In fact, TSMC has taken advantage of that program. They've invested their own money. They have built one foundry in Arizona. They're building two more. The one in Arizona is operational since 2024, late 2024, so just a few months ago. And the two others will be completed in 2028 and 2030. So there will be a little bit of dispersion from Taiwan of that chip making capability, but the most high-end chips will still be manufactured there for the foreseeable future. And it's not just chip manufacturing that Taiwan's critical to. It's you make the chip, you got to package it so you can put it on a printed circuit board. Well, the packaging and testing, Taiwan leads the world in that. And they also produce a lot of the printed circuit boards that those semiconductors are placed on that can be then placed in computers, different systems to make them operational. So that ecosystem that's developed around Taiwan Semiconductor is critical. It can't be easily replicated. And, I'd ask your viewers to think about, in a strategic terms, if Taiwan Semiconductor, say Taiwan said, okay, we're gonna come under your sovereignty. Well, then, Taiwan Semiconductor's got to listen to Beijing. Taiwan Semiconductor, they may say, Beijing may say, the Americans put chip restrictions on us. Maybe we want chip restrictions on them, and they could easily retaliate against us. And that would be, very difficult for the United States. It would take us a while to try to firmly develop that semiconductor industry and that whole system around it. So in that sense, Taiwan is very indispensable to the global economy. And not to mention that it's a highly functioning democracy, and its strategic location for Japan and the Korean Peninsula are vital for those nations there. And the last thing, the fifth thing, and maybe it's because of my background, I just think it's remarkable at how the massive effort that the Chinese are using, the cyber attacks and espionage efforts they direct at Taiwan. In January of 2025, the Taiwan National Security Bureau, so their equivalent of CIA, or kind of the CIA and their DNI mashed into one, they released a report that said that on a daily basis, the Taiwan government and Taiwan critical infrastructure faces 2.4 million cyber attacks. And that's up from about 1.2 million from 2023. Now, you think about the US and China attacking the US's critical infrastructure via Volt Typhoon or Salt Typhoon, as well as our telecommunication systems. And they've had success penetrating into our infrastructure and into our telecommunication systems. What do you think they've done in Taiwan? It's really their test bed for their cyber attacks against us, against the West. And then I would highlight also their espionage activity directed against Taiwan. In 2022, I believe it's around 10 Taiwan cases were charged with espionage-related crimes. In 2023, it was over 40. In 2024, it was 64 or so. And 2/3 of those were either serving Taiwan military personnel or recently retired. And you think about how they were trying to get new cases on how they were going after recruitments and conducting their espionage efforts. They were trying to use organized crime. So that's a lesson for us here in the United States, or Chinese organized crime is certainly in the United States. And the Chinese security services uses those networks to pass money, maybe do some operational acts for them. And that's certainly the case within Taiwan as well. They funnel money, and they used underground financial institutions and religious organizations that span both sides of the straits to pass money or to try to spot, assess, and try to recruit new sources. But for me, the most concerning thing about that report was that the NSB said they found, and they're very understated based on my experience with them, they're very understated on the threat, was that some of these military officers were tasked with casing Taiwan military facilities and foreign representative office, probably the American Institute in Taiwan, where I served, and developing an assassination teams and sabotage teams. And I've never really, in my experience, I don't remember that being so explicit in some of what the Chinese have asked of some of their agents around the world. So to me, that's a very concerning development and something that bears intense watching. So really, I think, Taiwan is just short of being under siege. And, I really firmly believe Taiwan deserves our support, not only because it's a highly functioning democracy, but it's really in our strategic interest to ensure that lifeblood of the advanced economy remains free and open to U.S. companies in order to protect our economy, quite frankly. So I'll stop there. I went on for a long time.
David, I think that was just excellent. There's so much to unpack with that. I mean, you spoke about shaping the population. This is what Beijing would love to do in Taiwan, shape the population. So people are all talking about unification, peaceful unification. The peer competitors, I think you make a very strong case when China has, on the militarization, have moved, as the word you used, rapidly to militarize, to include their nuclear capabilities in space, etc. But also the U.S. support to Taiwan is so important in this equation. And I think back to the Taiwan Relations Act and so forth. And then you spoke about a lot of the economic issues, the semiconductors and what China is doing with cyber and espionage operations. There's so much to unpack. So let's dive right into that. Alexander, you start first, and let's keep the dialogue going.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. And David, what an amazing portrayal of the strategic landscape in Northeast Asia and all the issues and tensions and pressures facing our good friend Taiwan in this very difficult environment. Again, you touched on all the bases. It's very, I don't want to waste our listeners' time to kind of repeat the key points which you made. I'm really startled by some of the language which you used when you talked about the breathtaking growth of Chinese military capabilities, which you validated as being really incredible. And also, as Ambassador DeTrani said, your definition of China is the peer competitor, not the near competitor, but the peer competitor of the United States. That's really very important. And I think all listeners of our program, they should pay attention to how you characterize the Chinese capabilities. But let me kind of pivot a little bit in a different direction. Because we have elections, presidential elections in this country. We now have a new sheriff in town, and this new president basically is reshaping American foreign policy all around the globe, basically sending earthquake-like tremors all around the world. And specifically, I want to talk about the fallout of the so-called nightmare summit between President Trump and what he called the Ukrainian dictator on February 28th, which may have caused a breach in the American-Ukrainian relationship and the relationship between the United States and its European allies, who seem to disagree with President Trump's peacemaking efforts. I mean, our president wants to bring warring parties together, wants to make peace despite very strong headwinds which he is facing. And specifically, I mean, he insisted on some respect and a sign of gratitude, a show of gratitude from a country where the United States contributed over $300 billion to defend that country. And yet, its leader came to the White House and was very disrespectful and unthankful, as Vice President Vance said and as President Trump repeated. So my question is very simple. What does it all mean for Taiwan? Why? Because yeah, we want the Taiwanese to spend more on defense. We want them to reduce their trade surplus. We want them to shift some manufacturing, semiconductor manufacturing plant to the United States. But we also want them to show some respect and some gratitude to this country for what we are doing, because we will be on the hook. If you fight against the Chinese, that is going to be a very expensive proposition. So what do you think President Trump's new stance, new attitude towards the allies and partners in Europe and Asia, everywhere? What does it mean for Taiwan? Some critics said it emboldens Beijing, actually, but others say no, the Taiwanese have nothing to worry about because they're playing their cards exactly right. So how would you evaluate President Trump's kind of policy towards Taiwan and its prospects for the situation across the straits?
Yeah, thanks, Alexander. I'll try to address this. I'll first talk about Taiwan, and then I'll talk about China. Now, honestly, I think probably the leadership in Taiwan is quite worried about what took place in the White House on Friday. I mean, the previous administration policy was to try to build this coalition of like-minded democracies to assist Ukraine in trying to hold off Russian aggression. And Taiwan was part of that. I mean, they frequently talk about the importance of democratic nations stepping up and trying to help Ukraine. And, there have been some volunteer soldiers from Taiwan that have gone over and fought. They've given some medical aid to Ukraine to fight, and also they've given some medical aid. But I'm sure the leadership in Taiwan could really use some type of reassurance from the Trump administration. And in one way to do that, in fact, is for the Trump administration to come out and say, it's hard for them to say this, but their rapprochement with Russia is really to allow us to kind of pivot more of our resources to Asia, to be able to, really to deter China from taking aggressive action, including Taiwan, moving forward. And if I were the Taiwan leaders, that whole, I'm a Democrat with a small d. I really believe in democracy. But I think, and I'm sure our leadership does as well, but I think what they really want is to try to increase jobs in the United States, to increase our gross domestic product, to make our economy flourishing. So if you're thinking about what to do, how to frame their policy toward the United States, I'd say, you tell them you want to buy as much LNG as possible. So liquefied natural gas, and you want to import that into Taiwan. That's not a small request there. You're also, of course, you're going to want to buy more weapons. And really, they bought a lot. They actually buy them. They pay for them. Unfortunately, our defense industrial base is still kind of standing up under the pressures of the Ukraine war, the war in Gaza, and it isn't able to meet production requirements quite fast. So there's been some delays in some of the weapon systems that the Taiwans have ordered. I also counsel them to really try to buy more U.S. agricultural goods, really try to make themselves, integral part of the economy with the United States. That advanced technology firms really should consider investing in the United States, and they have. And I think you'll see more of that moving forward. So that's kind of on the Taiwan side, what they can do to try to show that they're the indispensable or a very important part of the U.S. trading system, if you will. Now, the Chinese, on the other hand, I think they're going to very carefully are going to kind of sit back. They're going to try to analyze what took place in the Oval Office and what that means for themselves and for the world going forward. So for themselves, I know they pay very close attention to what's happening between the United States and Russia. And I don't think they're all that concerned that Russia is going to move towards the United States at China's expense. I'm pretty sure they understand that Vladimir Putin and will try to move Russia in the middle of that kind of triangular relationship, so they get the benefit from both sides. They get the benefit of the relationship with the United States, and they get the benefit with the Chinese. So this people have been talking about a reverse Nixon, and I just don't see it. I see Putin as being the beneficiary of that reverse Nixon effort, but China not really being all that impacted from it. In fact, I think Ambassador DeTrani did an op-ed not too recently, or very recently, about the Sino-Soviet split, and how, and part of that was how Kissinger and Nixon were able to wean China to the US side. Well, it's because Russia and China and the Soviet Union at the time were very close to war, almost a nuclear war breaking out. And that was the way they were able to say to China, you're better served cooperating with us. And there'd been a long, at least a decade of intense animosity between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union about who was the real leader of the communist world at that time. So China is assessing what's taken place with Russia and the United States, but it's also looking for opportunities to take advantage of our lack or movement away from Europe. Europe had been pretty solid with the United States about telling the Chinese, you need to deal with Taiwan, that Taiwan issue. EU leader, in particular the German foreign minister, they all have said stuff straight to the Chinese saying, what happens in the Taiwan Strait needs to be resolved peacefully. So I think the Chinese see this as an opportunity perhaps to try to fracture some of the EU countries and try to move them closer, move the needle a little bit so they're closer to China. And also their goal is really to isolate Taiwan. So I think that's going to proceed apace. I think it really tells the Chinese that their maximum coercion strategy can work, because they're seeing kind of that international alliance system of like-minded democracy kind of fracturing, and that helps their cause in trying to further isolate Taiwan and gives them diplomatic openings. I think another thing to keep in mind for your viewers to keep in mind, one of the main misinformation campaigns or disinformation campaigns the Chinese propagated during the Taiwan presidential election was kind of the doubt America theory. It's Huai Mei Lun, if my Chinese is right. And so they'd say, the United States is not a dependable partner. And they tried to propagate that in the presidential election. It didn't seem to work, because I think William Lai won. He's much more pro-US than he is pro unification or ties to China. But what happened in the White House gives them a perfect opportunity to try to propagate that message across to the people of Taiwan. And that what happens in other places in the globe has sometimes unintended consequences throughout the world.
Yeah, David, those are very, very, there's so much to unpack. Very, very good points. Let me comment and then ask you a question, David, along the lines of, and I totally agree with you. I personally think that when China is looking at the equation, they're looking at and taking the U.S. at its word, where we said very clearly that we're pivoting to East Asia. We're pivoting to the Indochina region. And, looking for peace with the war in Ukraine, and Russia is permitting the U.S. to have some latitude to pivot more to the Indo-Pacific region. So I don't think China should sort of view, my personal view, to view what's happening in Ukraine, where we're talking about peace. Let's peacefully resolve this. Let's do this quickly. I think I applaud President Donald Trump has said and is moving towards in that regard, obviously with security assurances, etc. But I think the pivot to East Asia, if you will, the pivot to the Indochina region should be of some concern or a lot of concern to China. Because, David, it's the word deterrence, and you use that word deterrence.
Right.
It's the question of deterring China. I mean, if we listen to our Indo-Pacific commander, who's saying this was a rehearsal for, if you will, a kinetic attack on Taiwan, well, I think we need to ensure that deterrence is alive and well. And part of that deterrence is not only Taiwan building and building capacity, capabilities. I mean, they're talking now about buying $7 to $10 billion worth of armaments from the United States. And David, I might add that the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 commits us to provide, and President Reagan with the 3 no's reiterated this, requires us to provide the defensive weaponry necessary for Taiwan to defend itself. So if I'm advising President Xi Jinping, I'm saying, Mr. President, look at the fact that this kinetic move on Taiwan, where the Taiwan government has capabilities itself, is something. What your credibility will do, what you will do to your economy, but also the U.S. piece to this equation. I think the former President Joe Biden spoke about defending Taiwan, being very, very vocal about actually defending Taiwan. So I think China has to consider all these elements. So deterrence, in your word, David, and I like that. Deterrence is so important. But I will say this, and then I'll ask you the question. I'll say this. What we've seen from China, certainly with President Xi Jinping, is a bit of hubris. Talking about China 2025, we're talking about 2027, where China will have the military capability of using a kinetic force to take over Taiwan if necessary. 2049, the sentinel of the establishment of the People's Republic of China, where China will be the preeminent global power. I mean, we can go back to the Phoenician Wars, and we can go back to the literature that's out there. But I think China sort of has to push back a little and realize it's not going to be that way. It's not going to be that way. Because the U.S. is, as you said, a peer competitor, and with the element of innovation, with the dynamic, the dynamism, dynamic aspects to what we have in the United States, I don't see us sort of ceding that space to the People's Republic of China. However, peaceful coexistence, where we can come together and so forth, that makes a lot of sense. So my question to you, David, is this. China got upset when the Trump administration removed the language, if you will, on their webpage of we do not support Taiwan independence. We removed that language from our website in that regard. So although we say we have a one China policy and we're very clear about that, has the United States been as articulate as necessary to reinforce that element of deterrence so that the People's Republic of China does not do something as foolish as using kinetic means to seek the unification with the Republic of China?
So I think that's a really interesting question. And I think that all through the Biden administration, Indo-PACOM has been trying to take measures to increase our hard power in the area. And I anticipate, and I certainly hope, that the new Trump administration will also continue that, maybe augment what was already being accomplished, and try to make our hard power much more important, much more visible, and so that Beijing understands if they're going to try to roll the dice, that's going to be very, very difficult. I will say that President Trump's meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan, the statement that was signed after that, really it also said, we oppose any unilateral change in the cross strait by force or coercion, which I think is really one of the first times that coercion part has really been emphasized in one of those kind of statements. It's always been about force. Now they've added coercion, and of course that's China's strategy. So I thought that was an important part, and I think for the Japanese, Taiwan is a vital national interest for the Japanese. And so we've seen that. One of his early calls also was to Australia. I think the Trump administration has also reached out to the Philippines. All those nations would be critical in trying to deter military conflict across the strait. I do think that we need to continue to nurture and use our European alliances. Those are important as well. As you know better than probably anybody, the importance of those, of our security service connections with the different countries in the world, what a force multiplier that is for the United States, how important trade is between our nations. I know we've been, I live in Minnesota, quite a ways from the Canadian border, but it doesn't do us any good to say we're going to make Canada the 51st state. Well, we're doing that, and we make 40 million Canadians mad and ready to go throw the gloves off in a hockey brawl. At the same time, they're sailing through the Taiwan Strait with us. We need that international coalition. China's huge. They're getting bigger and stronger. If it comes to kinetic war, which God forbid, we're going to need all hands on deck, all the friends in the world that we can possibly have. So I do think that if your strategy is to focus on the Pacific, great. Well, you're still going to have to nurture our alliances throughout the world in order to assist with your effort in the Pacific. So I think that's very important. And I'm going to say one last thing. I really think the destruction of USAID is very short-sighted. I do think the United States is a very wealthy country. And if you believe that our competition with China is global, and with Russia is global, it's the relief agencies and it's that function, AID's function, to go out into the global south, to show the flag, to promote our influence in those regions, some of those which have incredible natural resources that may be exploitable for the economy in the future. It's the way to have some influence. We're not going to have Fortune 500 companies aren't going to invest there. We're not going to have a large diplomatic presence there. So have those relief and aid organization go in there and try to feed, try to give medicine, etc., to some of the most difficult conditions on the planet. I think it's worthwhile doing, and it helps us compete against the Chinese globally.
David, I couldn't agree with you more on USAID, soft power, the ability to project the way we do, to include our cultural centers, talking about who we are as a nation, and the liberal democracy that we espouse, and the values we have. That's so powerful. So I totally agree with everything you said on that, David. Let's go to Alexander and keep this discussion going. Alexander.
Thank you, Ambassador. And David, I'm really glad that you mentioned that Taiwan is a vital national interest for Japan. And that's what I'd like to ask you about. Japan conducted the freedom of navigation operation in early February across the Taiwan Straits. And this is the second time. The first one they did together with Australians and New Zealanders a little bit earlier, and now they're doing it by themselves. Also, the new Prime Minister of Japan is really interested in forming what he calls the Asian NATO, which seems to be aimed at keeping China down, Russia out, and Taiwan in the Western democratic camp, if you wish. Now, so I'd like you to basically talk to us about how you see the role of Japan in the cross-Taiwan, cross-strait conflict, and whether, again, we should take it seriously, or whether, given Japan's peaceful constitution and the record of the past 70 years, we can basically dismiss it and think more about Europe's assistance or Canadian and Australians than the Japanese. So your take on Japan.
Vital to, it's absolutely vital to any type of defense of Taiwan. I mean, you know, for Japan, of course, they were acquired, won or seized Taiwan from China, the Qing dynasty in 1895, and ruled it for 50 years. And so a lot of the basic infrastructure was built by the Japanese in Taiwan. And so in 1945, when after the war was over, it'd been 50 years had been under Japanese rule. That Japanese was taught in the schools, and so there's a heavy Japanese influence within Taiwan, and Japan has looked quite favorably upon almost every person from Taiwan. But more importantly for the United States, Japan is the home of 50,000 U.S. service members, as you well know. And so those military bases that we operate out of are going to be critical for our ability to be able to respond to any type of aggression. It's whether the Japanese will allow us to use them militarily to be able to support Taiwan. And I think that's a big alliance issue. I think they will in the end. The Japanese self-defense forces, their Navy is one of the best in the world. And so we really want to have that on our side. And I think they will be, because, you think about Taiwan, if it's taken over by the People's Republic of China, which is hostile to Japan, that all that shipping lanes, all the shipping that goes to and from the South China Sea is going to be controlled by the Chinese. And that really has a profound impact potentially on Japan. And we also have to consider, if they take Taiwan, what does that do for the Senkaku or the Diaoyu Islands, which both sides, the Chinese and the Japanese, claim, so as well as the Taiwans. But the main issue people in conflict is Japan and China. Also, the Ryukyu chain. I know Xi Jinping has talked about the Ryukyu chain, where Okinawa is, with U.S. presidents in the past, saying, we had historical claim to that. And so that has to put the Japanese a little askance. I think about a year ago, Xi Jinping went to an institute in China where they study that Ryukyu Empire period, where they had their own sovereignty. Well, that's a clear message to the Japanese about what he's thinking about that of the Ryukyu Islands. So the Japanese are definitely afraid. I mean, that's maybe overselling it, but they're very concerned about what takes place with China. They're very concerned about what's happening in Taiwan. And, they are modernizing their military. They're trying to buy new equipment to meet that threat. And, the alliance we're trying to make it stronger. I think the Biden administration capitalized on what the first Trump administration did to make it more interoperable, make it more meaningful for both countries in order to protect global security in the Western Pacific.
No, those are very excellent points, David. Let me just follow up on something that Alexandre spoke about and you addressed. But I'll keep going back to deterrence, because I think that's so important in this equation. We don't want China, the corporate all countries, but certainly the people of Taiwan, 25 million people of Taiwan, don't want to see a kinetic approach, because the devastation would be immense. So we are encouraging Taiwan to purchase more, if you will, defensive military capabilities. And we see Taiwan doing that. $7 to $10 billion is not a small amount. You talked about conscription. But one of my questions will be, is Taiwan doing enough to defend itself? That's one of the questions. Are they doing enough? Are they showing that resolve? You talked about the porcupine and all that. So yes, that needs to be part of it. But you also spoke about the alliances and the U.S. commitment to defend Taiwan, because that is still out there, that element of ambiguity. Will the U.S. step up and get involved if China should do something of a kinetic nature, to include a blockade? Because I will say a blockade is an act of war, right?
Absolutely.
And we've seen China doing all these exercises around Taiwan. I mean, it's so blatant and it's so obvious. They're trying to intimidate the people of Taiwan, but also to get, I would think, to get the United States and others comfortable with, okay, this is our area and so forth. Well, I'm sorry, the Taiwan Strait, a free and open passage. The South China Sea, the same can certainly be said about that. Free and open passage. What they're doing with the Philippines is not acceptable. There's
Right.
no question about that. So on the element of deterrence, David, and this is my question. In addition to Taiwan buying more weaponry, defensive weaponry, and so forth, but there's a limited capability there per se. And with the exception of the United States and others, the allies coming together and so forth, making it clear, what else could be done to deter China from saying a kinetic approach isn't necessary? Now, I realize Xi Jinping has put this on the table. He can't walk away from that. He's made that clear. We want a peaceful resolution, but if we have to go kinetic, we'll go kinetic. What more can we do to convince the leadership in Beijing, and that's Xi Jinping, the president of China, that a kinetic approach is not in China's interest, and to reinforce that element of deterrence?
That's an excellent question, and it's kind of the $1,000 question there, right? And $1 million question. It's very difficult, and I just want to highlight some of the economic consequences from a war in the Strait. Right. In January of 2024, right before the Taiwan presidential election, Bloomberg did an excellent analysis of the economic impact from a war in the Taiwan Strait, and they estimated the impact to the global economy was about $10 trillion. So that would be the impact of the global economy together with the 2008 financial crisis. You put that together, and that's the impact that would have on the global economy. So a disaster, right? I mean, both those two, the COVID-19 and the global financial crisis, were a disaster for the people of the world. So we obviously don't want to have a war. The second thing, I mean, a blockade was estimated to be a $5 trillion hit on the global economy because of how central Taiwan is to the modern electronic economy that we live in. So how do you promote deterrence? Now, first of all, Xi Jinping is 71 years of age, 71 years old. He's made it clear, as I said before, that he wants to take back Taiwan. So we got to think that he's got, he's got at least a decade in power. His term is up technically in 2027. I bet a lot that he's going to get another term if his health is okay. So he'll be in power to 2032. And, he wants to be the guy who's taken back Taiwan. So how do you dissuade him from that? I think it's got to be hard power. I think it's got to be U.S. military power is increasing in the region, and he knows that if he does roll the dice, it doesn't mean you have to shove it in their face. I wouldn't do that. I would just quietly amass military power as much as I could. I mean, without giving up our other commitments, to show him that if he does roll the dice, there's going to be a big problem, and he probably won't win. And if he does try to go for a kinetic option and he fails, a real good chance his regime would fall. So you have to make it clear to him that if you guys do this, there's going to be a war and you might lose, and that's going to be an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party's continued rule in China. It's a difficult question, and I think and I don't think my answer is all that great, but I think
No,
essentially that's it.
no,
It's
no.
gotta be hard.
I think your answer is excellent, and I like what you just said. Alexander, we have only 1 minute, and I'll let you ask one quick question, Alexander.
Okay.
Alexander
That's
asked
the
a tough
question.
question.
It's a question about the ultimate deterrence option, the nuclear option. Can Taipei go nuclear? You look at South Korea, the growing nuclearization debates there. North Korea is a guarantee of its independence for two-state solution, wants nuclear weapons. I mean, Taiwan toyed with that back in the 70s. I mean, ultimately, if they feel the United States cannot defend them, can they go nuclear? Yes or no?
Okay,
We
great
have time for
question,
anything.
Alexander. Excellent
The answer
question.
is
David.
no. They have one operational nuclear plant. And they did have a nuclear weapons program, as you guys are well aware. Joe probably knows more about it than anybody, in which they, the Reagan administration shut it down. They're pretty close to building an actual weapon.
All right.
And, we had great insight, CIA had great insight into what was taking place there. But that capability, I think, is dispersed, and it would be very difficult for them, without it being detected, reconstituting it and trying to build a bomb.
Yes,
So,
no, I couldn't agree with you more on that, David. And Alexander, to your question, I mean, you mentioned South Korea, you mentioned Japan and so forth. I mean, that element of nuclear proliferation is on the table. There's no question about it.
No, I think South Korea and Japan, that's a different equation.
Absolutely.
They can do that much
Absolutely.
faster than Taiwan.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more on that, David. David, what a great discussion. David, Alexander, over to you, Michael. I think we put a lot of issues on the table for our viewers and listeners. This is an ongoing issue. It's such an important issue because Taiwan is a liberal democracy, and I go back to the Taiwan Relations Act. We have a commitment to them, and we sort of surprised them on 1 January 1979 when we formally normalized relations with the People's Republic of China. So we're there for Taiwan, and that's an important part of this equation. So today's discussion was right on the mark. So thank you, David. And
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. And over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. What an excellent show. So interesting and so much clarification of the current situation. David, we can't thank you enough. Alexander and Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, it's just fantastic. Very few programs out there give you this kind of depth. Usually it's a few paragraphs or a couple minutes. And David, your background really covers so much. I don't know if there is another issue in the world that's more pressing than this current situation with Taiwan. Even though it's not on the front burner like the other conflicts, it is really determining the future of the whole world.
Right.
And we thank you for this. I'm very grateful
Thank
to the
you.
Washington Times for covering this program. And I think they're going to have a lot to work with today. So thank you, everybody, for your support. And we'll see you next month on the first Tuesday of every month. Thank you.
Thank you.
This webcast is pre-recorded.